The second one of the four gates is Matsumai. And because you've read Howell's article about this place that talks about it in great detail, I'm not going to dwell too much on the basically the blow-by-blow of what Matsumai was and how exactly they controlled Ezo. Just stick to the broad outline. So basically Matsumai was this domain, this Japanese domain, on the southernmost end of what is today the northernmost island of Hokkaido. Take us back on the map. Hokkaido is basically out to here, and Matsumai is here, and from this small Japanese domain, which is actually walled off from the rest of the island, and the rest of the island is called Ezo, the Matsumai control the indigenous Ainu population through indirect means throughout most of the Tokugawa period. They use ceremonies, the Wimam and the Umsa, which are tied to commerce and kind of skewed in the favor of the Japanese. They use ceremonies to control trade with the Ainu, and also the construction of trading posts throughout Ezo, technically outside of Japan. They do this to control trade with the Ainu. They license, the Matsumai do, they license these trading posts to private merchants who then proceed to exploit the Ainu, setting the balance of trade in the favor of the Japanese. The Ainu become very dependent on Japanese foodstuffs and luxury goods, rice, sake, tobacco, and the value of their own goods, the things they hunt, and like birds for their rare feathers, and fish, including salmon. The value of those goods, well, basically there's overfishing, there's overhunting, the market collapses, and the Ainu become increasingly drawn to working as day laborers on Japanese-run fishing posts, which are also springing up in Ezo in the 18th century. And these are the same posts that are catching the sea cucumbers and the abalone and sending all of that to Nagasaki. So basically the Ainu become incorporated into the Japanese economy as these kind of subordinate peoples, as these lower status laborers, and they are incorporated into the Japanese economy despite the fact that they live in Ezo, which is technically not part of Japan. Basically what happens is that Ezo becomes, in effect, it becomes a colony of the Tokugawa state. This is actually a debatable point. I disagree with some historians who think that imperialism and colonialism is not appropriate to use in this situation. I basically think that there's no reason why an early modern feudal state like Japan cannot have an empire. I see how the empire is run on the ground, indirect control through economic, basically economic penetration of native societies, getting them dependent on manufactured goods, on foodstuffs coming in from the more settled society. And we see the same dynamic in the American West during the 18th and 19th centuries as well. And I think that basically imperialism and colonialism is a very good way to describe how this particular gate functioned. It became ever more tightly controlled by the Tokugawa. There was something throughout the 18th and very early 19th century happening in Ezo called the Santan trade, which was basically a trade where Chinese merchants made contact with Ainu, who made contact with Japanese merchants, and there was indirect trade with China through Ezo. But the Tokugawa actually cut off that trade that avenue of trade, because they did not want the Ainu to come into contact with non-Japanese peoples. And so as the Edo period wears on, this control over the people of Ezo, which is economic and ceremonial, actually comes to harden into a form of territorial control over the land that these people occupy as well. But it started out as control over groups of people. And when the Russians come south in the late 18th and early 19th century, it's going to be clear to the Tokugawa that they now also have to think about this northern borderland, in effect, as a buffer state and as a buffer zone, really, between themselves and the Russians, and to try to do something to set its boundaries more or less concretely. So Ezo was a very important part of the Japanese foreign relations system, and also a very important part of the economy, and in many ways Tsushima was as well. But Tsushima functioned along very different lines. The So daimyo of Tsushima, the So family ruled Tsushima. They maintained both commercial and diplomatic ties to Korea. They also facilitated diplomacy between the Tokugawa and the Kingdom of Korea as well. And they had been empowered by the Tokugawa to do this. So, as you read about in Tobi, basically what the So did, and by the way, that Tobi reading is one of the core readings in the field right now, not only in terms of Japanese diplomatic history, but in terms of the overall history of early modern Japan. Tobi's 1984 book just completely changed the field, and all Japan specialists are very much familiar with it. But basically, as Tobi describes, what Tsushima actually did was they funneled some Korean goods, silk, ginseng, other types of luxury goods, and pottery. Among these luxury goods were a lot of cow hooves and cow hides. There were very few cows in Japan, but leather was always needed for armor, for clothing, for other kinds of things, and cow hooves were made into combs and things like that. So there was a big market for Korean cow products in Japan. Koreans ate cow meat on a regular basis during this time period. In Japan, it was really a very rare occasion. But anyway, all of these Korean goods were funneled into Japan through the So, and the So were actually unique among the samurai, or certainly outstanding amongst Edo period samurai, because the samurai of their class did directly engage in trade. In fact, they earned their income from trade with Korea. Tsushima was a small island. It was agriculturally very unproductive, and so the way that the Lord of Tsushima sought to supplement the stipends of a samurai was to basically give them a cut of the Korea trade. So it was very important for the domain that this functioned, and also important for the Tokugawa. Because besides trade, the other things that came from Korea were diplomatic missions. In Japan, these missions were presented as tribute missions. There was over a dozen of them during the Edo period, and they were sent on special occasions, usually the ascension of a shogun, and they were seen by the Tokugawa as tribute missions, as the Koreans paying respects to a higher power, thus allowing them to partake of, or to be incorporated into, this Japan-centric foreign relations system. However, the great thing about early modern political culture was that there was room for mutually exclusive interpretations of the same event, because the Korean king claimed that in sending these missions, he was actually inspecting a vassal of his own. The So daimyo were indeed vassals of both the Korean king and the Tokugawa shogun. Now, in terms of the importance of these ties, clearly the Japan tie was the more important. The So were incorporated into the Tokugawa political order in a way they never were into the Korean political order, but they did formally pledge loyalty to the Korean king, and the Korean king didn't demand anything of them, but he used them as a way to send diplomatic missions to the Tokugawa. And the Koreans wanted to do this because they were kind of afraid of these crazy samurai who had tried to invade their country at the end of the 17th century. I'm sorry, at the end of the 16th century, under Hideyoshi. And they wanted to keep the Tokugawa satisfied and show them respect, while simultaneously in their own country portraying what they were doing in a very high-handed manner, saying, you know, we're going to check out what those crazy Japanese are doing. They shouldn't be making any more trouble, but we got to send an embassy just to make sure. And this added to the Tokugawa legitimacy, because the Tokugawa could say that these were tribute missions, and kind of this early modern tendency to be okay with both sides knowing this. I mean, that Tokugawa knew what the Koreans were saying to the Korean king were saying to the Korean people, and the Korean kings knew very well what the Tokugawa were saying to their own people, but both of them chose to ignore this because it was inconvenient. I think today we can learn a lot from that kind of approach. I think modern diplomacy is very much more structured on unilateral interpretations. There's only one way to read a relationship, and wars have been fought over differing interpretations of two countries' statuses vis-a-vis each other. And I think this kind of mechanism that the Tokugawa worked out with the Koreans, with the aid of the Tsushima daimyo, there's a lot to be said for it. There was this trade was also we're back to trade now. The trade was facilitated by the presence of a Japanese compound in Busan, in Korea, in much the same way that there was a Chinese compound in Nagasaki. This was called the Wakan. At least in Japanese it was called the Wakan. In Korean it's called the Waegwon. And this walled compound in Busan, in this port city in Korea, was manned by So clan samurai, and it was basically this outlying trading post. So really, I think I want to draw your attention to the fact that we have all of these strict maritime prohibitions. Japanese cannot go abroad. If they go abroad, they won't be able to come back. Well, you know, you have Japanese trading posts all over Ezo. You have a Japanese trading post in a Korean city. The Tokugawa political order, including the foreign relations system, was much more complex than historians had previously thought. Which is important to not only look at Tokugawa pronouncements of this kind of omote reality in order to know what was happening, but also to look at other kinds of sources as well, and comparing diplomatic sources with laws, etc., etc. In the volume of trade, I also have to say, during the Tokugawa period, the trade with Korea really decreased. It never ended, and it remained especially important for the So, but in terms of sheer volume, it fell off drastically, and basically by the end of the Edo period, the domain government of Tsushima had fallen into a deep financial crisis. More on that later. Gate number 4, the Ryukyu Kingdom in Satsuma. This one was, as all of these gates, it's unique in some ways. It's also fascinating. The Ryukyu Kingdom, which, if you remember this map, isn't quite on this map, I do apologize for that, but it's basically here. It's a string of islands, not very agriculturally productive, but in a very good location for maritime shipping. This island was, or not this island, this series of islands centered on the main island of Okinawa was basically a trading empire. They utilized their comparative advantage. Their ships were, in the center of the Japanese, this intersection between the Japanese economic zone, Chinese economic zone, and even Southeast Asia. And Ryukyu royal authority was in many ways based on having this maritime trading empire. For reasons which are fascinating, but which we really don't have time to go into, in 1609, the Satsuma domain, ruled by the Shimazu family of that domain, basically appealed to the Tokugawa for permission to go and conquer the Ryukyu kingdom. The Tokugawa said yes, and with a few thousand samurai, the Satsuma forces landed and quickly won a military victory over the Ryukyu kingdom. Then what happened is the Ryukyu king was allowed to keep reigning, and the Ryukyu state was basically allowed to keep existing, but the king of the Ryukyus had to swear to act as a vassal to the lord of Satsuma, who was himself a vassal of the Tokugawa shogun. So you have this interesting relationship where an independent kingdom is a technically independent kingdom is a client state of a not fully independent Japanese domain, and then somehow they all owe their allegiance to the shogun in Edo. This kind of arrangement was enforced by a Satsuma military presence in the Ryukyu court in Shuri, in the capital city, and as far as trade was concerned, it was actually a windfall for Satsuma merchants, and many Ryukyu merchants actually could be forgiven for not knowing that many things had changed. Because Japan, through the Ryukyus, was now plugged into these different economic zones throughout Asia in a way that was distinct from Nagasaki. So Ryukyuan goods, especially sugarcane, flowed into Japan through Satsuma, but also many Chinese goods, the same silks and teas and everything, flowed into Satsuma and to the rest of Japan through the Ryukyus as well. And some more exotic goods also found their way to Japan in this fashion. And a major source of revenue for the Satsuma domain was basically control over this flow of foreign trade. One of the most astonishing things, though, about this relationship is that at the same time that the Ryukyu king was a vassal of Satsuma, they remained a vassal of the Chinese king as well, or a tributary state of the Chinese emperor as well. They paid homage to two masters, one of which said we have universal political power, and the other one of which said we have universal political power, because through Satsuma they were ultimately subordinate to the Tokugawa, who were claiming the same thing. And just as in the case of Korea, both sides knew what was happening, but both Japan and China chose to ignore mentioning the Ryukyus in their communications for the sake of maintaining peace and maintaining trade and basically maintaining stability in the region. This survived two Chinese dynasties. In the 1640s, the Ming dynasty was overthrown by the Qing, who were actually technically not even Chinese. They were Manchu peoples. And the Qing inherited this strange arrangement with the Ryukyus involving Japan from the Ming, and they didn't really care. There was a appreciation in this early modern period for letting sleeping dogs lie, and that really has a lot to do with explaining why this another potentially explosive situation didn't really explode. It only became a problem, this arrangement did, after Japan had been penetrated by Western influence in the 1850s, and Japanese and Chinese governments knew that due to Western pressure they had to kind of reach an accommodation with the on the Ryukyu issue, and eventually Japan just annexed it. In a not a very fair process, but that's how it ended up. It's fascinating also. I mean, you have entries from Chinese diplomats, for example, who go to the Ryukyu court, and they go and present themselves before the Ryukyu king, and the Ryukyu king says that he is a faithful vassal of the Emperor of China, and the Chinese envoy records something like, well, you know, it was a very nice ceremony, but during this whole time there was this weird Japanese samurai behind a bamboo screen pretending that he wasn't there watching this whole procedure, and I just kind of thought that I'd ignore him because it would be awkward if I was to make it clear that I knew that he was watching me. Very keen appreciation for ambiguity, for compromise, and for just not making trouble when it wasn't necessary. And the Ryukyu kings sent, along with trade goods, also sent embassies to Edo in the same way that the Koreans did. Ryukyuan embassies went up to Satsuma, and sometimes they'd stop there and turn around and go back to the Ryukyus, and sometimes they would be forwarded on to Edo to pay respects to the shogun. And these embassies were grand events. They were public opportunities to demonstrate the power of the Tokugawa to their own subjects. These great processions winding their way along the Tokaido and along the river and coastal routes of Japan and down the city streets of Edo, the power of the Tokugawa on full display. And why are they powerful? Because foreigners are paying them homage and doing what they say.